The Westchester Union Township Historical Society will now read the names of veterans interred in the Brookside Cemetery. Ernest Ock, Jack Acree, William Adams, Gerald Adams, Charles Agnew, Joseph Allen, Gary Andrews, Francis Armstrong, Charles Arnold, Clarence Ash, Paul Arthur, Gerald Arthurs, Thaddeus Ayers, Eric Abramson, Raymer Alpha, Thomas Amiot, Deborah Ashburn. Vincent Babb, Andrew Bachman, Elmer Back, Delbert Bailey, Robert Bales, Harold Balser, Joseph Bammer, Clinton Bannon, Kenneth Barkus, Robert Beringhouse, Roger Barlow, Hosea Barnes, Larry Barnes, Andrew Bachman, A.J. Barrow, Frederick Barthel, Alexander Bartholomew, George Bartholomew, Harry Bates, Nylan Bates, Sammy Joe Ball, Ralph Baumel, Edward Baxter, Vera Mae Bays, James Bays, James Beaver, Charles Beaver, Eugene Becker, John Beckett, Samuel Beeler, John Bell, Luther Bell, Orville Benjay, Richard Bertram, Harry Beliski, William Bierman, Otto Binder, Leo Binnegar, George Bishop, Edward Blake, Charles Blasky, John Bohenlander, Clarence Bolser, Homer Bolser, Jacob Bolser, John Bone, Cyrus Bone, L.P. Bonner, Irvin Booth, Cecil Bowen, Henry Bowen, Walter Bowling, Alfred Gerard Bramble, Otis Brandenburg, William James Brait, George Brayton Sr., Rodney Brazell, Harold Brazell, Moses Brecount, J. Brecount, Gary Brenner, Charles Berleau, Anna Brewer, Elder Russell Brewer, Ezra Britton, Alfred Britton, Herman Britton, Robert Britton, James Brom, Clyde Brooksbank Jr., Wilbur Brown, Harold Brown, Daniel Brown, Glenn Burlage, Edwin Burgess, Fred Burdine, John Burdine, Nathan Burgess Jr., Sfar Burklow Sr., Ernest Bullock, Lowell Burris, Howard Butler, Fred Cable, Jesse Calchera, John Caldwell, James Campbell, Edmund Carey, Patrick Carland, Raymond Carr, Willie Joe Carr, Walter D. Carr, Jeffrey Lynn Carson, Owen Cartmel, Raymond Case, Jesse Caudell, Paul Sobolewski, Carl Cheney, Eugene Cheney, George Cheney, Noah Lawrence Cheney, James Cavender, Clifford Chilton, James Choate, Francis Chrisman, William Clark, Jakey Clonch, Ralph Clausen Jr., Thomas Cleary Jr., Gordon Clemens, Robert Clance, Baxter Cornett, Thaddeus Cohey, Everett Cole, Vernon Condon, James Harold Connor, Edward Connors, Robert Cook, Roger Dale Cooper, Ralph Cooper, Gordon Crosswaite, Tommy Costello, Irvin Cox, John Cox Sr., Joseph Cox, Josephus Coy, Thomas Coy, Roger Coy, Thomas Clearly, Gerald Kramer, Isaac Crum, Homer Cullum, Ted Cummings, William Craig, Woodrow Cromer, J.P. Cummings, J.P. Cummings, William Daly, Richard Dahmer, Andrew Daniel, Richard Davenport, William Davidson, Warren Monroe Davis, Warren Davis, Harold Davis, John Day, James Dibbler, Charles DeBoard, Carl DeBoard, James DeBoard, James Martin DeBoard, Troy DeBoard, Denver DeFevers, R.L. De La Roche, Carl Denton Jr., Carl Denton Sr., Thomas Dexter, William Dickerson, Ernest Dingman, Elwood Dingman, Charles Dingman, Clarence Dingman, George Dinkle, William Devine, Blair Donahue, Edward Donnelly, Frank Doofman, Timothy Downey, Alfred Drago, Herbert Drake, Stanley Dudley, James Dudley, John Dudley, Harrison Duffy, Paul Duncan, Earl Dunham, Edward Dunlap, Howard Dunlap, Eric Dunn, John Durham, Charles Eaton, Melvin Edwards, Norma Agnew, Jesse Elkins, Clement Elliott, Sarah Elliott, Isaac Elliott, Jay Elliott, John Elliott, John Sherman Elliott, Elias Ellis, Elias Ellis, Raymond Emerson, James Emery, William Emmons, Gerhard Erfenbeck, Lawrence Irvins, Edwin Esslinger, J. Parker Evans, Robert Ewing, Robert Faberell, Donald Fair, Jerry Farmer, Fred Farmer, Paul Farmer, Donald Fatute, Carl Federline, Macklin Henderson Fearing, Kenneth Fee, William Farrell, John Fitchell, Thomas Fightmaster, Sam Fishman, John Fitzsimmons Sr., John Fitzsimmons Jr., Donald Phobes, Robert Flynn Jr., Jerome Foley, Peter Fortney, Norbert Francis, William Francis, James Frazier, Terry Fry, Carl Frondorf, Frank Gaberlich, Thomas Gateskill, John Gallagher, Donald Gurhees, William Genesee, C.W. Gerard, George Gerard, G.W. Gerard, Herman T. Gibbs, Jr., William Gibson, Harold Gilbert, James Gilbert, Harry Ginn, Jesse Godby, James Godby, David Godier, Charles Gottmiller, Carl Gottmiller, Carlos Goforth, Gerald Goforth, James Goforth, James Golden, James Goldrainer, Robert Goldrainer, Daniel Gorman, Thomas Gorman, William Gorman, Clarence Gorsuch, Edward Gorsuch, Joseph Gorsuch, Raymond Gorey Sr., Raymond Gorey, Garnet Gorey, William Graydon, William E. Graydon, Robert Graff, Robert Grant, Emmett Charles Gravitt, Owen Gray, Charles Gray, Joseph Clifford Gray, Joseph Gray, Floyd Green, V.O. Green, Roy Green, Elmer Gregory, Robert Griffin, George Griffiths, Eugene Griffith, Harry Griffith, Robert Gruber, Donald Gershwin, James Gulliam, Chalmer Gullett, Herman Dale Gullett, Louis Gunler, my grandfather, Carl Gunler, Robert Guy.
Garland M. Hale, Clarence Hall, James J. Hall, George A. Hall, Robert Austin Hall, Robert Ham, James Hamilton, Harold K. Hamilton, Roy E. Hance, James F. Hanna, Charles W. Hanna, Richard V. Hanna, Harry Raymond Hanna, Eric T. Hansen, Bernard A. Harmon, Lillian May Harper, Ansel Harper, Joseph Eugene Hart, William J. Harvey, Forrest W. Hawkins, Charles Albert Hartman, Robert Hasselfeld, Walter D. Hawks, Fred P. Hawks, Ernest L. Hawks, James O. Hawks, Joseph P. Hazlitt, George C. Head, Charles Linus Hedges, Stephen Hefner, George J. Hain, Albert Heights, Thomas R. Helton, William R. Helton, George E. Hendricks, George R. Hendricks, Donald L. Hendricks, David W. Hendricks, Richard P. Hendricks Sr., W. Henners, Charles Henry Jr., John B. Henry. Robert Herkins, Carl Hess, George Frederick Hertel, Eugene Lawrence Hetzer, Charles A. Hewitt, John Walter Hickman, Eldridge Frank Hickman, John Hill, Richard Dale Hill, Wendell Wayne Hill, Joseph C. Hilrick, Billy H. Hinkle, Bobby Ray Hinkle, Glenford E. Hitt, Bert Hawkmouth, Clarence Holder, Henry Clay Holliday, S. K. Holtzinger, Stanley F. Hunterlaw, J. O. Hunterlaw, Walker Hornsby, Robert E. Horder Jr., Eastley Horton, James T. Houston, James E. Houston, Paul J. Howard, Rex Howard, Robert Howard, Guy N. Howard, Stephen Howard, Charles Hubbard, Harold Huning, Joseph Huber, Marjorie Ann Huffman, James Lee Huffaker, Sam Huffman, Reed D. Hughes, Robert Hulse, Lee Holtz, Harry Hummel, Alfred J. Humphrey, Henry E. Humphrey, Walter Larry Humphrey, Robert Humphreys, Robert Dean Hunter, James E. Houston Sr., James Houston Jr., Herbert H. Hutcherson, Vernon K. Hutton, Fred M. Hutzelman. Howard S. Engel, Lawrence Edward Isaacs, Hobart Marion Isaacs, Ewell Edward Isaacs, Willard Isaacs, John B. Ivan, Samuel Ivins. Harold Jackson, Walter D. Jackson, Rudyard K. James, Walter R. James, Arnold C. James, James Roscoe Jenkins, Harvey J. Johnson, Oscar L. Johnson, Garnett Claire Johnson, Thomas Johnson, Oscar B. Johnson, George Jones, John H. Jones, Earl H. Jones, Harry C. Jones, Jasper Jones, Ralph C. Jones, Ralph T. Jones, Robert Jones, Everett L. Jones, John Jones, Robert Murphy Jones, Donald Lowe Jones, Emil Jonty, Frank Lester Jonty, Alfred Jonty, Emil Jonty, Bryce A. Jordan, John W. Joseph, Hillary C. Joseph, Arthur A. Joseph. Kenneth Kammerer, Gilbert Carrick, Jerome C. Cass, Thomas F. Castens, Walter R. Kastner, Edward Lee Keener, John J. Keener, Leon Keeling, Alvin Francis Kempner, Reuben John Kellner, Edwin J. Kelsch, Albert Jesse Key, Conrad Key, Dale Otis Kimball, Ernest Carl Kincaid, Lewis H. Kinney, Robert R. Kinney, William Kinney, Thomas William Kistner, John J. Coble, Frank Conan, Frank Klein, Charles J. Nolman, J.Q. Knott, Harry I. Cruson, Wilmer Crodel, Robert Kuhlman, August Kurtz. Harold Labadie, Edgar L. Lacey, Stephen D. Lake, Charles R. Lampy, Robert W. Landenswich, Robert M. Landenswich, George F. LaRue, Robert G. Skinner Larson, James Cleve Lawson, David Robert Lemke, Charles O. Lemmer, Jack Lee Llewellyn, Boyd B. Lewis, Carol Jean Lewis, Gerald R. Lewis Sr., George R. Lewis, Louis Lebestro, Celia Linkmeyer, Ernest Roy Lintner, Robert V. Little, Thomas J. Littlejohn, Henry Long, Jack Andrew Long, James W. Long, George W. Long, Gerald W. Long, Ronald Looney, Dallas Lower, Leon Lovins, Frank J. Loon, Paul John Loon, Herschel Luke, Manuel M. Likens. John Thomas Mallory, Hughes H. Maines, Edward I. Mann, Roger D. Manthe, Roy Herman Marcus, John J. Marino, William D. Martin, Robert J. Martin, Alfred Martin, Edwin Curtis Martin, Charles N. Martin, Walter W. Martin, William L. Martin, Ralph A. Martin, Lawrence Martin, Clarence A. McAdams, John McAdams, Floyd W. McCullough, Kenneth D. McCullough, Paul E. McCullough, Ronald L. McDaniel, David I. McGinnis, Klein McGowan, Edwin Earl McKendry, John A. McKendry, Cecil F. McKibben, Arthur J. McKinney, James McKinney, Joseph McMacken, Clifford McGuire, Harry McGuire, Myron K. Meal, Robert C. Meltzer, Thomas Rodney Mercer, Carl E. Menser, Robert C. Murderly, James Messner, John Messner, Ewart Mune, Betty L. Michael, R. L. Middleton, Alex Miller, Wilbur L. Miller, Larry V. Miller, Jared Parrish Miller, John Miller, Ralph A. Miller, Roy V. Miller, Samuel C. Miller, Samuel E. Miller, William Harry Miller, John Carter Mink, William E. Mink, Jack Dudley Manier, Ralph Minter Jr., Ralph H. Mitchell, Gerald Thomas Moorfield, Milburn Molen, Larry Arnold Molen, Forrest G. Montaigne, Lawrence C. Moore, Robert W. Moore, Carl B. Moore, Ernest Ralph Moore, John S. Moreland, Jerome L. Mortensen, Earl A. Moses, George K. Moses, Furman Mosteller, Ruby B. Muchmore, Oliver Charles Muchmore, George Muhlenpoe, Paul Mullins, Melvin C. Mullins, John Muntz, Elisha C. Murphy, Elijah Murphy, Isaac N. Myers, Peter Myers. Leroy Nagel, William M. Needham, Roy O. Needham, Ronnie Ray Needham, William Lloyd Needham, Casper Neely, Freddie William Nelson, Hubert C. Newmister, Chester C. Nicely, Silas J. Nicolay, Carl E. Niemeyer, Richard Nixon, Samuel Nixon, Michael Anthony Nocero Sr., Joyce Nocero, P. Nuris, Edwin Stark Nusky, Edward Nuss Jr., Edward Nuss, Charles Nutley.
Russell Oglesby, Ronnie Oldfield, William H. Osborne, Elmer J. Osner, Marcellus A. Osner, Thomas Henry, Clifford Paul Osterman, George M. Overby, James Kelly Overby, Gary Lee Overby, Danny Ray Overby, Donald K. Owens, James O'Connell, Kenneth O. Walker. Anthony John Pallotta, Manton Clay Parker, Austin Parrott, Eugene N. Patch, David M. Patterson, Donald D. Patterson, Hubert R. Patterson, Dellard Payne, Lloyd Payne, Joanne Peck, Lawrence Peel, Daniel S. Pelletier, Arthur Nathan Pennington, Giles V. Perkins, Cletus Perkins, Claude Perkins, Charles R. Perrin, Charles Jefferson Perry, Robert A. Peters, Kenneth H. Peters, Jacob Plah, Lewis L. Phelps, Gary Lee Phelps, Steve Allen Phelps, Defoe Phillips, Albert Wayne Phillips, William M. Phillips, Billie Jean Pickard, Mark Albert Pearson Sr., Charles Thomas Pollard Jr., Lauren David Powell, Billy Wayne Powell, Samuel E. Powers Sr., Donald Pointer, Clarence D. Pointer, James W. Pruitt, Kenneth Profiter, William J. Prince Jr., and Kenneth Norman Quist. Robert Rack, David H. Rackley, Earl G. Ron, Thomas J. Rash, Karen Lee Rash, Fred Rasnick, David Reed, John R. Rebholz Jr., Morris F. Redman, Edgar Eli Redman, Horace C. Reeling, Mary A. Rehall, James G. Reinhardt, Robert Richard Rempel, James G. Rennergarb, Ludwig Carl Retberg Jr., James R. Richards, Charles Richards, Paul Lloyd Richards, Vernon C. Richardson, Charles R. Richardson, G.I.P. Richardson, Frank Alt Richardson, William L. Ricking, William Rick, James E. Riesenberg, Malin B. Riker, Stanley D. Riley, Gerald L. Ringeisen, Joseph E. Robbins, James Roberts, Larry Paul Robbins, Gerald E. Rowe, Herbert C. Rollins, Raymond Rosenberger, Carl Lee Rosenkrantz, Arthur E. Ross, Leo C. Rossolo Jr., and my dad, Eugene Clyde Rossolo, Arthur Roth, Donald William Rother, Charles Rowan, Dean Roy, Anna M. Rudinsky, Fred Ruling, William C. Runyon, and Robert Leroy Ryan. Willia Dean Sainer, Gary M. Salee, Sue E. Salee, Steve Sams, Carl R. Sanders, John A. Sauer, Edward A. Saman, George Shearer, William A. Schmidt, Robert C. Schobert, Russell N. Schramm, William D. Shriver, Herman W. Shriver, Adolph F. Schultz, Charles William Schultz, David Lee Scott, Edward Scott, Harry L. Scott, Harry A. Scudder, Luther Selby, Lonnie Self, William J. Semler, Kenneth Sr., John Bryan Sensabaugh, Clinton W. Seward, Cyril Edward Shannon, John A. Sheehan, Samuel M. Sheets, Ed Shields, Tom H. Shelton, Jerry W. Shelton, Carl Shepard, Alfred Earl Shepard, Donald Shepard, Virginia Shewalder, Jock L. Shoemaker, James David Shrout, David E. Shoemaker, Carl Lewis Shirty, and Eugene Seibert. George J. Sechrist, James Douglas Sissom, James Kelly Sizemore, John Sloan, Robert Smart, Herman Smith, Clyde James Smith, Daniel R. Smith, Jerry Smith, Randall Smith, Stanley Smith, Ralph L. Snyder, John Snyder, Charles W. Snyder, Joseph Salzman, Robert W. Summers, George Jefferson Sowards, January Spinner, Enos W. Spurrier, Thomas Stafford, Frederick Stahl, L. Ray Stevens, Ellis Richard Stevens, Emery F. Stevenson, Donald Stepp, Charles Frank Stewart, J.C. Stewart, John W. Stewart, Dennis Stewart, Samuel Stickles, Ronald Stogsdill, James C. Stokes, Robert C. Strafe, Arister Strethon, Alvin Stroley, James Russell Strunk, Elmer Soupy, Clifford Soupy, and Robert Soupy. James W. Swanson. Clarence Tackey, James Tanner, Lloyd V. Talby, David A. Thompson, Lloyd V. Talby Jr., William E. Tegeter, Ray E. Thompson, Harold Thompson, Richard L. Tillapa, Billy Tong, D. Larry Tooley, James Totten, Richard Townsend, William W. Tracy, Frank J. Trombetta, George E. Troutman, John M. Tullis, Robert S. Tunning, Harold Turk, Edgar Turk, and Sally K. Tyler. R.S. Vance, Ova Desmond Vance, Troy Vance, Jacob Van Dyne, Bobby Van Landenham, Charles Venata, Roscoe F. Vanover, William Varnow Jr., Russell C. Vaughn, Harry M. Vaughn, Kermit Vaught, Jerome Voorhees, J. B. Voorhees, William A. Voss, and Clarence L. Voiles. Porter Wagers, Carl A. Waldbillig, Charles Wallen, Alvin M. Walsh, Eunice Alta Walsh, Robert C. Walter, Michael Warnes, James Warren Jr., Victor Wayne Washburn, Robert C. Watson, Harry O. Weaver, Cecil Peyton Webb Jr., James R. Weber, Jonah L. Webster, Harley Webster, George Carl Leake, Paul Weimer, Ray Wells, Jake Marvin Wells, Ralph Welsh, Ralph Welter, Larry Wirtz, Marvin T. Wesley, Paul A. Wesselman, Joseph A. West, E. Gerald Whaley, Jacob Wallen, Robert J. Wallen, John Wharton, Walter Wharton, John Curtis Whitaker, Walter Whitaker, Audie Whitaker, Anthony White, Glenn E. Whitehouse, Clarence E. Wansteller, Richard Wicke, Dennis H. Wilcher Jr., Thomas F. Wilcox Sr., Howard J. Willer Jr., Irvin Willer, Carol L. Williams Sr., Asa Williams, Thomas Scott Williams, Ben W. Williams, Daniel B. Williamson, John B. Williamson, P.O. Williamson, Albert Wilson, Edward Wilson, William A. Wilson, Robert E. Wilson, James E. Wilson, Clifford Wilson, Kenneth Wilson, Homer Wilson, Jack Lee Wilson, Richard Emmons Winburn, William Winter, William George Weiss, Christopher Witt, Ralph E. Witter, Anthony Worrell, Clifford Worrell, Robert W. Weisty, Richard M. Weisty, Charles L. Woodrum, Manuel Wayne Woodrum, Charles Wood, Manuel W. Woods, William F. Woods, Edward J. Woody, William C. Wright, Joseph Wright, John H. Wright, James Arthur Wright Jr., J. H. Yeager, Jacob Yarding, Edward Young, my husband, Ronald Young, Mansford Young, and John J. Zimmerman, and Eugene Zinke. Thank you. That concludes the reading of the veterans' names that are interred here at Westchester Cemetery.